What would you do if the person you love the most shattered your heart in the most brutal way? In this gripping tale, follow my journey through the darkest corners of betrayal, humiliation, and ultimately, revenge. But be warned, this is not your typical story of heartbreak. It's about uncovering the masks people wear, reclaiming power, and making them pay for their sins. Stick around to the end for a twist that will leave you speechless. Chapter 1. Introduction to Hell. They say love can blind you, but I never realized it could also bind you handcuffed to a life of misery. I was once an optimist. 10 years ago when I first met Emily, she was everything I ever dreamed of. Confident, sharp-witted, and beautiful in a way that made heads turn. I couldn't believe my luck when she chose me. Back then, I didn't see the signs, the subtle criticisms disguised as jokes, the way her laughter seemed just a little too sharp when it was directed at me. Life with Emily was never quiet. Her words could lift me to the heavens or cut me down to dust. And over time, the balance tipped. Laughter turned into scoffs, affection into disdain. Yet, I stayed. I told myself it was love. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't love. It was fear. Fear of losing her. Fear of starting over. Fear of what people would think if the perfect couple crumbled. Our home was a battlefield dressed as a suburban dream. The house in the suburbs, the perfectly mowed lawn, the dinner parties where Emily would tell stories, each one punctuated with a jab at me. "Oh, Mark? He's harmless." She'd say with a smirk that always got a chuckle. Harmless. That word followed me everywhere. The first real crack appeared on a Friday night. Emily came home late, reeking of perfume that wasn't hers. She claimed it was from a friend at work, a hug goodbye. But something didn't sit right. I tried to brush it off, but the nagging doubt lingered. Then came the receipts. Dinner for two at a restaurant I'd never been to. Text she quickly swiped away when I entered the room, the constant smirk on her face as if she knew a secret I'd never understand. I should have confronted her then, but I didn't. Harmless Mark. Spineless Mark. I hated myself for it. But that night, lying awake next to her, I realized something. The man she thought she'd broken, he was still there, buried under the weight of years of insults and self-doubt. And for the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was anger. Chapter 2. A House of Ghosts. A home should be a sanctuary. Mine had become a prison, haunted by whispers of betrayal and shadows of a woman I no longer recognized. Our house stood like a postcard of suburban perfection. White picket fence, flower beds meticulously tended by a gardener Emily hired, because, in her words, "You are hopeless at that, Mark." To any outsider, we were the perfect couple, living the American dream. But inside, that house was cold, lifeless. It wasn't a home. It was a tomb filled with the echoes of what we used to be. Each room told a story of her dominance and my submission. The kitchen, where she'd scold me for overcooking her eggs, became a place of dread. The living room, where we used to laugh at movies, was now her throne, where she sat scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my existence. And our bedroom? That was the worst. It wasn't a place of intimacy anymore. It was a battlefield of cold shoulders and muffled tears. I began to notice more. The faint whiff of cologne on her clothes, the way her phone was always turned screen down, the late-night work meetings that stretched well past midnight. I knew the truth, but I wasn't ready to face it. Instead, I wandered the house like a ghost, silently screaming at the walls, asking them if they'd seen what I feared. One night, as Emily slept soundly beside me, I found myself in the basement, searching through old photo albums. There we were, young and happy, smiling at the camera as if nothing could ever go wrong. I studied those photos, desperate to find the moment where things started to change. But it wasn't in the photos. It was in the years between them, the subtle digs, the eye rolls, the way her laughter had turned from joyous to mocking. The basement became my refuge, the only place in the house that still felt like mine. I started keeping a notebook there, writing down everything I noticed. The unfamiliar names on her phone, the times she came home late, the way she avoided my eyes when I asked about her day. It wasn't just paranoia, it was preparation. I began to see Emily for who she truly was. She wasn't the woman I fell in love with. She was a master manipulator, someone who thrived on control, on making me feel small. But she had underestimated me. She thought I was harmless, that I'd never fight back. In the quiet of that basement, I made a promise to myself. I would gather my strength, bide my time, and when the moment was right, I would strike. The house wasn't just haunted by our past anymore. It was haunted by what was to come. I was no longer the helpless ghost she wanted me to be. I was becoming something entirely. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. Sometimes the truth doesn't creep up on you. It slams into you, like a freight train in the dead of night. It happened on a Thursday evening. I had come home early, something I rarely did. Emily hated surprises, and I had learned long ago that it was easier to stick to her schedule than disrupt it. But that day, something drew me home, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. The house was eerily quiet when I walked in, the kind of silence that screamed something was wrong. Emily's car was in the driveway, but the usual hum of the television or her voice on the phone was absent. I stepped into the living room, and that's when I saw it. Her coat draped carelessly over the back of the couch, her shoes discarded in the middle of the floor. She never left her things like that. I don't know what made me go upstairs. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was that gnawing suspicion I'd been pushing down for months. As I climbed the steps, my heartbeat grew louder, each thud echoing in my ears. When I reached the bedroom door, I heard it laughter, hers, and then a man's voice. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I saw them. Emily and a man I didn't recognize. They were sitting on our bed, her hand resting on his knee, his lips brushing against her neck. My bed. My wife. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the scene playing out in front of me like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Finally, I stepped back, the creak of the floorboard under my foot giving me away. Her head snapped up, and our eyes met. For a brief moment, I saw panic in her expression, but it was quickly replaced by something else, indifference. She didn't even bother to stand up, didn't rush to explain or apologize. She just looked at me and said, "You weren't supposed to be home yet." The man, Nick, as I would later learn, had the decency to look uncomfortable. He muttered something about leaving, but Emily stopped him with a hand on his arm. "No need," she said. "Mark and I were just about to have a conversation, weren't we?" I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mind racing. When I finally managed to find my voice, it was barely above a whisper. "How long?" She rolled her eyes as if my question was an inconvenience. "Does it matter? You had to know this was coming." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. But it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the way she said it, so casual, so devoid of remorse. I realized then that she didn't see me as her husband anymore. She saw me as an obstacle, a nuisance. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers. But instead, I turned and walked out of the room. Her laughter followed me down the stairs, each sound like a dagger in my chest. That night, I didn't go back to the house. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, staring at the stained ceiling as the events replayed in my mind. I felt broken, humiliated, weak. But as the hours passed, something inside me began to shift. The rage I had felt in the basement was back, stronger than ever. It was no longer just a flicker. It was a wildfire, consuming every part of me. Emily thought she had won. She thought she had broken me. But she was wrong. She hadn't broken me. She had awakened me. Chapter 4. A new plan. Revenge doesn't come in a burst of rage. It's patient, calculated, and precise, like a spider spinning its web. The motel room was dark except for the faint yellow glow of the street lamp outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cheap alarm clock on the nightstand. The minutes ticked by, each one pulling me further from the shock of betrayal and closer to something far more dangerous. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg her to explain herself. Emily had destroyed my pride long before her affair, and now she had set fire to the last pieces of my trust. But in doing so, she made one fatal mistake. She underestimated me. The next morning, I called in sick to work a first for me. My boss didn't question it. I'd been the reliable, forgettable Mark for years. But this wasn't a day for spreadsheets and reports. This was a day for strategy. I drove back to the house while Emily was at work. Stepping inside, I felt a strange mix of familiarity and alienation. This was my home, but it wasn't mine anymore. It was a stage where she played out her lies. I started in the bedroom, opening drawers, checking her closet, her nightstand. She'd become careless, probably assuming I was too oblivious to notice the signs. Hidden beneath a pile of scarves, I found a shoebox. Inside were receipts, photos, and even a handwritten card from Nick. To my fiery Emily, who keeps life exciting, it read. I clenched the card in my hand, but instead of tearing it apart, I slipped it into my pocket. This was just the beginning. I spent the rest of the day piecing together the threads of her betrayal. I dug through her emails on the shared laptop, finding carefully deleted messages that she didn't realize could be recovered. I combed through her finances and noticed unusual withdrawals money she must have used for her secret rendezvous. By the time I finished, I had a clear picture. Emily's lover, Nick, wasn't just a fling. He was a con artist, someone who preyed on women like her. The more I learned, the more I realized how dangerous he was not just to her, but to me as well. But that didn't matter. In fact, it played right into my hands. That evening, I sat down in my basement refuge, the shoebox of evidence beside me. I opened a notebook and began to write. Not just notes, but a plan. Each step was meticulous, every action deliberate. This wouldn't be about petty retaliation. It would be about dismantling her world piece by piece. I started with her reputation. Emily's career was her lifeline, the one thing she valued above all else. She worked in a high-profile PR firm where appearances meant everything. If I could expose her Leisure affair, her secret withdrawal sit would send ripples through her professional life. Next, I turned my attention to Nick. I wanted to know everything about him. His weaknesses, his vulnerabilities, his past. I spent hours online tracking his social media, his connections, his business dealings. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that Nick wasn't untouchable. He had skeletons in his closet, and I was going to drag them out into the light. But most importantly, I planned to make Emily question everything. Her confidence, her control, her power over me all had to crumble. I didn't just want her to lose. I wanted her to know that I was the one who had taken her down. By the time I put the notebook away, the rage inside me had turned cold. It wasn't an inferno anymore. It was ice. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of purpose. She had played her game thinking I was too weak to fight back. But the rules were about to change. Chapter 5. Finding Weakness. To bring someone down, you don't need to be stronger. You just need to know where to strike. The first step in any plan is reconnaissance. I needed to know Emily and Nick's patterns, their habits, their weaknesses, so I became a shadow, blending into the background while observing their every move. Emily was predictable. She always had been. Monday through Friday, she left for work at 8 a.m. sharp. Lunch was at her favorite cafe downtown alone, or so I'd thought until now. I followed her one afternoon, parking discreetly across the street. Sure enough, Nick appeared, sliding into the seat across from her like he belonged there. They talked, laughed, leaned in close. Her hand brushed his as she handed him a napkin. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay focused. This wasn't about emotions. It was about gathering information. Nick, on the other hand, was harder to pin down. He didn't have a regular job, which made sense given his con artist background. Instead, he drifted from place to place, always looking for his next mark. I tracked him to a dingy bar on the outskirts of town, where he spent hours chatting up strangers, flashing that charming smile. It didn't take long to see his game. He wasn't just after Emily, she was a piece in his larger puzzle. That was the opening I needed. I began digging deeper into Nick's past. His online presence was carefully curated, but cracks started to appear when I looked closer. Old forum posts, abandoned social media accounts, even a few police reports under a different name. Fraud, theft, assault, it was all there, buried beneath layers of aliases. But the real jackpot came when I found a record of a failed investment scheme. Nick had scammed a group of investors out of thousands of dollars, only to disappear before they could press charges. It was his Achilles' heel, the kind of mistake he couldn't afford to have resurface. Armed with this information, I started laying the groundwork for my plan. First, I needed to plant seeds of doubt in Emily's mind. She thought she had the upper hand, that I was oblivious to her affair. But what if she started to suspect that Nick wasn't who he claimed to be? I created an anonymous email account and sent her a message, posing as a former acquaintance of his. The email was simple. Emily, I am writing this because I care. Nick isn't who you think he is. Look into his past before it's too late. Don't let him ruin you like he ruined me. I knew her well enough to predict her reaction. She'd dismiss it at first, her pride refusing to let her believe she could be deceived. But the doubt would linger, gnawing at her. Next, I needed leverage. I returned to the basement and began copying all the evidence I'd gathered, the receipts, the emails, the photos. I compiled them into a neat package, labeling it for Emily's eyes only. It wasn't time to use it yet, but when the moment came, it would be devastating. As I worked, I thought about the irony of it all. Emily had spent years tearing me down, making me feel like I was nothing. Now, I was using everything she had taught me, her manipulation, her cunning against her. Finally, I turned my attention back to Nick. I wasn't just going to expose him to Emily, I was going to make sure he couldn't con another person again. Using the contacts I'd uncovered, I reached out to one of his former victims, a man named James who had lost his life savings in Nick's scam. James was hesitant at first, skeptical of my intentions, but as I laid out the evidence I'd gathered, his anger reignited. "If you are planning to take him down," James said, "count me in." With James on board, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Emily and Nick had no idea what was coming. The trap was set. All that was left was to wait for the right moment to spring it. Chapter 6. The First Blow. The first strike is never the hardest, but it's the most important. It shakes the foundation, makes them question everything. The email had been sent, and I waited, watching Emily's behavior closely. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. At first, she carried on as if nothing had changed, but subtle differences began to surface. She started glancing at her phone more often, her expression tightening with every notification. The calm, smug Emily I'd come to know was fraying at the edges. I kept my distance, giving her space to stew in her thoughts. The tension in the house was palpable, an unspoken war brewing beneath the surface. She hadn't confronted me yet, but I could see the gears turning in her mind. She was trying to piece together a puzzle she didn't even know existed. The first real sign came one evening when she returned from work unusually late. She was quiet, distracted. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as she poured herself a glass of wine, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't say a word to me, just retreated to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her. That night, I heard her on the phone with Nick. Her voice was low, urgent. "Someone sent me an email," she said. "They know about you, about us." I smiled in the dark. The seed of doubt had taken root. But the email was just the beginning. The next step was more direct. I knew Nick frequented the bar on the outskirts of town, so I paid a visit myself. The place was dimly lit, reeking of stale beer and desperation. It didn't take long to spot him, holding court at a corner table, his charm working its magic on a group of strangers. I didn't approach him, not yet. Instead, I spoke to the bartender, slipping him a 20 and asking a few casual questions. "That guy over there," I said, nodding toward Nick. "He seems like a regular." The bartender smirked. "Yeah, that's Nick. Always got a story, always got a scheme, you know the type." I filed the information away, thanking the bartender and leaving without making contact. Nick didn't even notice me. He was too busy spinning his web. The next morning, I took things a step further. Using the evidence I'd gathered on Nick's past scams, I created a dossier and mailed it anonymously to his current landlord, his gym, and most importantly, Emily's boss. I didn't expect immediate results, but it was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. By the end of the week, the first blow landed. Emily came home furious, slamming the door behind her. "Did you talk to someone about me?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I feigned confusion, setting down the newspaper I'd been pretending to read. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Mark," she snapped. "Someone's been spreading rumors about Nick, about me. Do you think this is funny?" I looked at her calmly, my heart racing beneath my composed exterior. "Emily, I don't know what you are talking about. Maybe your precious Nick has more enemies than you realize." Her face twisted in frustration, but she couldn't argue. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. As I sat there listening to the muffled sounds of her pacing upstairs, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one on the defensive. The cracks in her perfect world were widening, and this was just the beginning. Chapter 7. The collapse begins. A house built on lies doesn't fall all at once. It crumbles piece by piece, and every fragment reveals the rot beneath. The fallout from the first blow was even more satisfying than I had imagined. Emily grew increasingly erratic, her polished facade slipping with each passing day. She was constantly checking her phone, snapping at coworkers during hurried phone calls, and, most telling of all, spending less time with Nick. One evening, she came home late, her makeup slightly smeared and her usually perfect hair in disarray. I watched from the kitchen as she threw her bag onto the counter and poured herself a glass of wine, gulping it down like it was water. "You seem stressed," I said casually, leaning against the counter. Her eyes flashed to me, narrowed. "Work's been a nightmare," she muttered, the lie slipping from her lips without hesitation. "Really?" I asked, tilting my head. "Because I thought Nick was your way of relieving stress." The glass in her hand froze mid-air, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the stem. She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. The next day, I set the second part of my plan into motion. It was time to tighten the noose around Nick. Using the contact I had made with James the man Nick had previously scammed, I coordinated an anonymous tip to the local police about Nick's activities. I wasn't aiming to have him arrested just yet. I wanted to make him paranoid, to make him wonder who was watching and why. It worked faster than I expected. That evening, Nick's car was pulled over a block from our house. From my vantage point at the window, I saw him talking animatedly with the officers, his usual charm failing him. They didn't arrest him, but they searched his car thoroughly before letting him go. Later, Emily's muffled voice filtered through the walls of the bedroom as she argued with Nick over the phone. "What do you mean someone tipped him off? Who? No, I don't think it was Mark. He's two." Her voice trailed off, and I could almost hear her mind scrambling for the right word. Weak? Oblivious? Harmless? Whatever she thought I was, it didn't matter. I was none of those things anymore. The following week, the cracks in Emily's professional life began to show. The anonymous dossier I'd sent to her boss had made its way to HR. Rumors started circulating about her affair with Nick, and whispers of financial discrepancies in her work accounts only added fuel to the fire. She came home one evening, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously. "They're auditing me at work," she said, her voice tight. I feigned concern. "That's terrible," I said. "Do you think it's because of?" I let the question hang, pretending to hesitate. "Because of what?" she snapped, her tone defensive. I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe someone found out about you and Nick." Her face went blank, the color draining from her cheeks. "No one knows," she said, more to herself than to me. "Are you sure?" I asked softly, watching as the doubt I'd planted began to take root. That night, I heard her crying in the bathroom. It was a strange sound, half despair, half frustration. She wasn't sad about what she'd done. She was angry about getting caught, about losing control. Nick, on the other hand, was unraveling faster. The police visit had spooked him, and his movements became erratic. He started canceling plans with Emily, leaving her increasingly isolated. When they did meet, their argument spilled into public view, her once prized image of perfection now a crumbling facade. The collapse had begun, and it was glorious to watch. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Chapter 8. The Power Shift. Control isn't taken by force. It's surrendered by those too blind to see it slipping away. By now, Emily's world was teetering on the edge of chaos. Her work life was under scrutiny, her relationship with Nick was unraveling, and the paranoia I had carefully cultivated was beginning to consume her. She was no longer the confident, manipulative woman who had spent years keeping me under her thumb. She was something else entirely unsure, defensive, and most importantly, vulnerable. I decided it was time to move closer to the center of the storm. Up until now, I had remained in the shadows, letting Emily and Nick destroy each other. But now, I wanted her to see me, to feel the weight of my presence in ways she couldn't ignore. The opportunity came one Sunday morning. Emily sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in her trembling hands, scrolling through her phone with a vacant expression. She didn't notice me enter the room until I spoke. "Rough week?" I asked casually, pouring myself a cup. Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "What do you think, Mark?" I shrugged, leaning against the counter. "You seem distracted. Is it work, or is it Nick?" Her face twisted in anger, but there was a flicker of something else here. "What do you know about Nick?" she demanded. I took a sip of coffee, letting the question hang in the air. "I know enough," I said finally. "Enough to wonder why you'd risk everything for someone like him." Her eyes widened, her grip tightening on the mug. "You don't know anything," she said, her voice shaking. I set my cup down and leaned in closer. "Don't I?" She stared at me, her bravado crumbling. For the first time, I saw the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure anymore, not about me, not about Nick, not about anything. The shift in power was subtle but undeniable. She was no longer in control of the narrative. I was. That evening, I made my next move. I knew Emily was still trying to hold on to Nick, despite everything. So I sent her another email from the anonymous account. This time, I included a link to a public forum where victims of Nick's scams had shared their stories. I watched her read it, her face growing pale as she scrolled through the posts. She confronted Nick the next day. I didn't have to hear the conversation to know how it went. She came home late, her eyes red, her movements sluggish. She didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me. She just went to the bedroom and shut the door. Nick, on the other hand, wasn't taking things so quietly. That night, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, His voice was sharp and angry. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Just someone who doesn't appreciate what you've done," I said calmly. "You think you can mess with me?" he snarled. "You have no idea who you are dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I am dealing with," I replied. "Do you?" There was a long silence before he hung up. The next morning, Emily confronted me. She stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "You are behind this, aren't you?" I looked at her, unflinching. "Behind what?" "All of it," she snapped. "The emails, the rumors, the police." I let the silence stretch, watching as her composure unraveled further. Finally, I spoke. "Maybe you should ask yourself why all of this is happening. What choices led you here?" Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she might break down entirely. But she didn't. Instead, she turned and left, slamming the door behind her. The power had shifted, and she knew it. She just didn't know what to do about it. Chapter 9, Exposing the Truth. Here is a moment when lies can no longer shield the guilty, and the weight of truth shatters what's left of their world. The time had come to take the veil off entirely. I'd watched them squirm long enough, and the satisfaction of their unraveling wasn't enough anymore. I wanted Emily to confront the full extent of what she'd done and to see that I had been the architect of her downfall all along. It started with Nick. His confidence had eroded over the past few weeks, but he still clung to the illusion of control. That illusion shattered one evening when he showed up at the house unannounced. I heard the knock and opened the door to find him standing there, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something raw and desperate. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room. I closed the door calmly and followed him. Emily was in the kitchen, her head snapping up when she saw him. "Nick, what are you doing here?" He didn't answer her. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes blazing. "You think you are clever, don't you?" Emily froze, her gaze darting between us. "What's going on?" I smirked, taking a seat on the armrest of the couch. "Nick seems to think I've been meddling in his affairs." Nick jabbed a finger in my direction. "Don't play games with me, Mark. I know you are behind this. The cops, the emails, the dossier, it's all you." Emily paled, her hand gripping the countertop for support. "What dossier?" she asked weakly. I stood, pulling a folder from the drawer by the television. "This one," I said, tossing it onto the coffee table. "Go ahead, take a look." She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for it. When she opened it, her face contorted in horror. Inside were copies of everything I'd uncovered about Nick's scams, his aliases, his police records. "Is this true?" she whispered, looking up at him. Nick scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "Don't act like you didn't know. You are not innocent in this, Emily." Her eyes widened. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means," I interjected, "that you were just another mark to him, another pawn in his game." Emily turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "You did this? You planned all of this?" I nodded, my voice steady. "Yes, Emily, I did. Because for years you lied, manipulated, and tore me down, and when that wasn't enough, you brought him into our lives." Her tears turned to anger. "You are pathetic, Mark. You couldn't stand up for yourself, so you had to resort to this?" I stepped closer, my gaze piercing hers. "No, Emily. What's pathetic is thinking you could keep living a lie without consequences." Nick, sensing the situation spiraling out of control, tried to interject. "This doesn't change anything. You think you've won, Mark? You are just as miserable as you've always been." I turned to him, my voice cold. "Maybe, but you are done here. The police are watching you, your scams are exposed, and Emily, well, she'll be dealing with her own fallout soon enough." Nick glared at me, but didn't say another word. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Emily collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "What are you going to do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I sat across from her, my tone devoid of emotion. "That depends on you, Emily. You can keep trying to fight, or you can start cleaning up the mess you've made." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of hatred and regret. For the first time in years, I felt free not because I'd won, but because I no longer cared about her approval or her games. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Chapter 10. Reclaiming Myself. Freedom isn't found in revenge, it's found in what comes after, when the shackles of the past are finally broken. The morning after Nick stormed out, the house was eerily quiet. Emily stayed in the bedroom, the door closed, and I didn't bother checking on her. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of her presence pressing down on me. The air felt lighter, as if the poison had finally started to drain. I spent the day reclaiming pieces of myself that I had long forgotten. I went for a run through the neighborhood, my feet pounding against the pavement with a rhythm that felt steady, reliable. I stopped at a local cafe and ordered a coffee, sitting by the window to watch the world go by. It felt strange, being alone without the usual cloud of anxiety or resentment hanging over me. By the time I returned home, Emily was waiting in the living room. Her makeup was gone, her hair unkempt, and she looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything had finally crushed her. "We need to talk," she said quietly. I nodded, sitting down across from her. "I am sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. For everything." I studied her, trying to gauge her sincerity. It didn't matter much anymore, but a part of me wanted to believe she meant it. "What are you sorry for?" I asked, my tone calm but firm. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't look away. "For treating you the way I did," she said. "For cheating, for lying. I was selfish, and I didn't care about how it hurt you." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Why are you telling me this now?" She hesitated. "Because I don't have anything left to lose," she admitted. "Nick's gone. My job is hanging by a thread. And you don't even look at me the same way anymore." I nodded slowly. "You are right. I don't." The words hung between us, heavy but final. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, wiping her eyes. I needed to say it." For a long moment, I didn't respond. Then I stood, looking down at her. "I am not the same man you walked all over, Emily. I don't need your apology to move on, but I do hope you figure out who you are when T here is no one left to manipulate." She flinched at my words, but didn't argue. She knew there was nothing left to say. Over the next few weeks, the pieces of my life began to fall into place. Emily moved out, taking only what she needed. I didn't fight her on it. The house felt emptier without her, but also cleaner, like the ghosts of our toxic past had finally been exorcised. I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I reconnected with old friends, people Emily had pushed away over the years. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. It was strange rediscovering the things that once made me happy. One evening, as I stood in front of a canvas, brush in hand, I realized something profound. My revenge hadn't been about punishing Emily or Nick. It had been about reclaiming my power, about proving to myself that I wasn't as weak or insignificant as they had made me feel. But now, revenge didn't matter anymore. The past was behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt free to look ahead. Chapter 11. A new beginning. The past doesn't define us. It teaches us. And from its lessons, we find the strength to rebuild. The first night alone in the house was strange. The silence wasn't oppressive like it used to be. It was peaceful. I sat on the couch, staring at the walls that had once felt like a prison, and for the first time, I imagined them as something else blank canvas, waiting to be filled with something new. Emily was gone. She left a note on the counter the day she moved out. I didn't open it at first. It sat there for hours, a folded reminder of everything we had been through. When I finally unfolded it, her words were brief. "Mark, I hope you find peace. I am sorry it took me so long to see what I did to you. I am sorry for everything. Take care of yourself. Emily." I folded it back and put it away in a drawer. Not because I needed to keep it, but because throwing it away felt unnecessary. Her chapter in my life was over, but the lessons it had taught me would remain. I threw myself into work, into hobbies, into rediscovering the parts of me that had been buried for years. The art was a lifeline. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it until I stood in front of a canvas again, letting the colors and shapes spill out in ways words never could. One day, while walking through the park, I noticed a woman sketching on a bench. Her movements were fluid, her focus intense, and something about her reminded me of myself before life had gotten so complicated. We struck up a conversation about art, about the things that inspired us, about the struggles we'd both faced. Her name was Claire, and she had a way of looking at the world that felt refreshing. She didn't see people as broken or whole, good or bad. She saw them as evolving, always in motion. I didn't fall in love with Claire that day. I didn't even consider it. But it was the first time in years I felt like I could share a piece of myself with someone else. Over the following months, life became a series of small, meaningful victories. I got a promotion at work, started selling my paintings at local art shows, and reconnected with family members I hadn't spoken to in years. And then, one evening, As I was preparing for another art exhibit, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked different, stronger, more confident. The man staring back at me wasn't the same Mark who had once let himself be trampled by Emily's cruelty. He was someone new. I still think about Emily sometimes, not with anger, but with clarity. She was a lesson I needed to learn, a catalyst for the change I had resisted for far too long. Nick, too, is a distant memory, a shadow from a time when I let others define my worth. But the most important thing I've learned is that life isn't about erasing the pain of the past. It's about building something better in its place. As I step out the door that evening, heading toward a gallery filled with my work, I take a deep breath and smile. The road ahead is uncertain, but for the first time, it's mine to choose. And that's more than enough. Life is full of moments that test us, break us, and force us to confront truths we'd rather ignore. But those moments don't have to define us. They can shape us, teach us, and push us to grow. What would you do if you found yourself in Mark's shoes? Could you find the strength to reclaim your life and rebuild? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our journey for more stories that challenge, inspire, and provoke thought. Because sometimes the darkest chapters teach us how to write our brightest ones.